Hi, everyone. Welcome to ArtiFact 64. I am joined once again by Benjamin Studebaker. He was actually on my show last year where we discussed his first book. It was an academic publication on the chronic crisis of, I'd say, democracy in general, but perhaps American democracy more specifically. And more recently, he has a book that's about to be released at the end of November on legitimacy in liberal democracies, which really builds upon the first book. And we're going to get into that. But before I do that, let me just give a quick update to viewers of the channel. Many of you guys have probably noticed that I haven't been doing too many updates in the last few months. That's because I've been pretty thick in finishing our first feature-length film on the greatest American poet you guys have never heard of, Bruce Ario. He died in Minneapolis a couple of years ago. And we've been doing the first screening in Minneapolis this past week. We're going to have more screenings next year all over the country, hopefully. And in the meantime, for patrons, the film is available for streaming on 4K if you are capable of watching 4K either on your phone or on YouTube TV or whatever. And we have the selected poems. That was just released in the past week or so. So that is available. That comes with a 150-page critical essay on his life and work from his literary executor. So it's a pretty hefty, substantive book. At the end of the screening, I was just kind of lost in one of the poems, just reading and rereading it. Very, very Wallace Stevens-esque, which is pretty surprising if you know the work of Bruce Ario. So uh, we're also actually just in the thick of starting the filming for our next work. It's going to be mostly in Savannah, Georgia, but some in Minneapolis as well. So just getting that little bit out of the way. So without further ado, we are back on YouTube. We're back to these updates. We're back to doing these shows, and I'm glad to have Benjamin back on. We're going to discuss the election. We're going to discuss his text and everything in between. Maybe if there's anything that you would like to say by way of introduction. And by the way, I'm sorry if I called you Ben. I know that you insist on Benjamin Studebaker. So maybe we could start off with that.
You could always call me Ben interpersonally. I just always put Benjamin on anything I write.
Hmm.
Yeah. So yes, the book Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies will be out at the end of November with Edinburgh University Press. There will also be a paperback within 12 months. That paperback should be significantly cheaper than the hardcover that will initially be released. So if you're somebody outside the academy and you would be intimidated by an expensive academic hardcover, do wait for that paperback.
Hmm. Good to hear. Yeah, because I also saw the Kindle edition is kind of expensive. I also know that your other book has also been frequently like on pretty steep sales, so we should watch out for that too. Maybe we could just start with the election in general and just weave your book into it. So you and I think neither of us were surprised with Trump's election. I've been kind of, going on for a long time, like more than a year now, when we thought it was going to be a Biden-Trump contest. I said, well, these are all the dangers that Biden faces. And the fact is, it's like a ticking time bomb because like starting in, September, but even like, especially October, November of last year, right, once the Gaza stuff happened, there's no way that any of that would have been better by the time of the election, right? Even if you're one of these people that believes that foreign policy doesn't really matter to the electorate, that's sort of true, but a general sense of malaise in the electorate does matter. And two failed wars and everybody's against America and so on and so forth, that just doesn't look very good. Biden, of course, had the disastrous debate. And after Biden dropped out, I remember Benjamin tweeted something out like, well, what's the alternative? We're going to have Kamala Harris. The more that the electorate knows her, the less that they are enthused about her. Which I thought was a smart comment. I thought it was true. And I, wrote an essay months ago saying, as the weeks go on, it's just going to get more and more in Trump's favor, and most likely he's going to win. I'm going to link that essay. I'm not sure if you, Benjamin, have wrote anything about that or if you just sort of gave general commentary, but what was your general thought of why you thought that Biden or Kamala were going to end up losing the election?
Yeah, so it's a difficult cycle for incumbents, not just in the United States, but globally, because of the inflation that came out of the response to the COVID pandemic. Nobody wants to talk about COVID anymore for understandable reasons. Nobody enjoyed it. But the thing that people are still talking about is the cost of living or inflation, which is only to some degree associated with COVID and with the COVID policies. People tend to associate inflation with whoever is in office when it occurs. And people tend to be very unforgiving about it. If you have over 5% inflation for any length of time while you're in office, if you are the leader of one of these rich countries that usually targets 2% and usually gets pretty close to 2%, once you get up to 5, it's really hard to go into another election, even if that election occurs years later, because people will, even if the inflation rate comes down, still have an awareness that in 2019, prices were 20, 25% lower, depending on sector. So I think that makes it very, very difficult. Then there are all of the issues with Harris and with Harris as a candidate and with the strategy of Harris. And I think all of those things made it worse, but it was always going to be an uphill battle simply because there was inflation. And if you go all the way back to 2020, I was doing some of the rounds back then. I went on Nathan Robinson's Current Affairs podcast, and I made the point in 2020 that if Biden wins, when the inevitable consequences of the COVID measures are felt by the population, Biden and the Democrats will get the blame for that. And it will make 2024 a very difficult cycle. And I specifically said the left always gets blame for anything that goes on when a Democrat is president. The left, because it has tailed the Democratic Party, is not able to disentangle. So if you're someone who has socialist or progressive politics, you do not want a Democrat in office during the period immediately after the COVID pandemic, because people are going to think it's your fault. They're going to think socialist policy in some way had something to do with that. And it doesn't matter whether that's true or not true. It's just going to make the whole situation politically harder for you. I said all of this in 2020, and nobody listened to me because people convinced themselves that Trump, I don't know, posed some kind of existential threat to the country or democracy, or that he was going to start a war with Iran, or whatever it was that they convinced themselves of as the harm reduction argument for why they had to get Biden in immediately. And what happened? Really, what Biden did is continue many of the same policies that Trump started for dealing with the pandemic. If we're talking about the Paycheck Protection Program, if we're talking about writing people checks with the president's name on them, these are things that were done by Trump, extending the surplus unemployment benefit to cushion the pandemic. And Biden wound those things down gradually over the course of the first 2 years. And the whole debate between the Democrats and the Republicans was just how fast to wind that down and how much infrastructure spending to do alongside it, and whether the infrastructure spending should be traditional versus green. That was really most of the argument. We were going to get elevated inflation regardless of who won the 2020 election. And whoever won that election was going to be less popular. And it's because Biden won that Trump is associated now with economic success.
Well, there's a few threads there we should pick up on, such as the difficulty that incumbents face, because there was actually one incumbent that won in a landslide, and we should talk about those factors as well. But also Kamala Harris as a candidate. One thing that has not been discussed enough is the fact that Democrats who sound and act like Kamala Harris, they just simply cannot be president. That's just a fact of life. It's true that somebody like Trump could go up there and not make a lot of sense, or, say things that are just kind of silly or controversial in some way. But it's fine, right? Because the Republican base just votes differently. They have a different sort of set of loyalty metrics. Whereas for Democrats, you are always essentially on thin ice. And when I would watch her just like the first sit down interview, right? So first she was hiding out for a month. People were saying that, that's brilliant marketing, right? She's going to be a blank slate and people will just etch anything they want onto her. That sort of worked with Obama. That's not going to work with somebody like Kamala Harris, who has no gravitas, right? At least if Obama had a gravitas, you could etch what you want and believe in it. With Kamala Harris, it's not really the case. So she waits out a month, right? When she finally does have that sit down, it's less than 30 minutes. It runs for about 28 minutes. And you have essentially Tim Walz chaperoning her. That's what it looks like. He's, standing over her shoulder. She has to sit down with him for this highly scripted, highly edited interview. That's not going to work. There's so many cringeworthy moments where she's either unable to answer questions or she's so clearly very, very nervous and anxious looking in her, just everything about her. People like that, as a Democrat, if you're running as a Democrat, you cannot get elected if this is your personality and this is how voters perceive you. You may say that it's unfair, but that's just a fact of life, right? That's just a problem Democrats have to face. The other thing about her is just this it is very odd, right? These like pivots to these so-called, Cheney voters that I don't even think they really exist. I mean, I don't know who. It's just so surreal watching it because, growing up, like to me, the big thing when I was growing up was like, oh, you would go and you would protest the Iraq War, right? If military recruiters would come to my high school, I would be out there arguing with them, and to have all these zombies essentially return. I remember like when I saw Alberto Gonzalez, right, was giving his endorsement. I thought like it can't be that, and like that Gonzalez, like he it wasn't that the torture guy. What like how is this even possible? Like he left in total disgrace. You never heard from him again. He was doing some like weird DEI stuff with like various academies, right? Which is nice and ironic. But these people are not supposed to return. And as the weeks went by, I was like, all right, it's more and more the chance that she is going to lose, right? We don't even have to get into the polling. Like you don't have to be very sophisticated about it. Like Real Clear Politics had her behind, many points behind Clinton, even more behind Biden. It's like, well, what do you expect, right? You expect the polling to have been fixed, and the fact that you had like a 0.1% lead for Harris, you thought that's going to play out in some sort of landslide. None of it really made any kind of sense to me.
Yeah. I like to think about it in terms of if in 1992, when George H.W. Bush had been looking at the bad poll numbers and the success of Perot and Clinton relative to him, he had decided to drop out. And then the party, to try to keep the funding together, had picked Dan Quayle and put Dan Quayle at the top of the ticket. Dan Quayle is someone that just strikes people as unserious. And that
Mhm.
would have not helped. It would have been a major problem to have Dan Quayle at the top of the ticket in 1992. It would not have given the Republicans a better chance. And I think a lot of the time when people start talking about why is Kamala Harris a bad candidate, if you even say this, people go, oh my God, you must be sexist. You must be racist. There must be something wrong with you. Well, what if it was Dan Quayle? Because really, Dan Quayle and Kamala Harris have a lot of the same problems, which is that this is, in both cases, somebody who is picked for demographic reasons, right? George H.W. Bush picked Dan Quayle because Dan Quayle came from a different part of the country and appealed to a different kind of Republican voter, right? And Biden, coming from the East Coast, coming from Delaware, picked a candidate for VP that he thought demographically would resonate with a different group of voters from himself. The problem with both Quayle and with Harris is that if they talk, voters realize that they are not able to speak extemporaneously in a fluid way. So they don't project competence. They don't seem like they're able to do the job, right? So if you have that problem, then the more people hear that person talk, the bigger the problem becomes. So what you do is you start trying to hide that person away so that they don't get media attention. And then, if you do have to go to them, you have to hope that the amount of attention they receive is very limited. A lot of people said the problem was that Harris didn't get enough time to make her case. Quite the opposite. If
Mhm.
Harris had been put on the top of the ticket 30 days before the election, she would have been better off. The problem is that's not how balloting works. You can't wait that long. Legally, it doesn't work. So of course they brought her out at the latest possible moment that they could and be sure that she would get on the ballot without legal challenges and that the money would transfer over. And then they tried to delay having to start the campaign for as long as they could because they know what's going on. And then you had the terrible infighting in her campaign between the older staffers who looked at the data and understand that she must not get media attention, that that is the worst possible thing, and the young people who joined the campaign because they were excited about her and thought that maybe there was some kind of wheels to her in terms of public opinion, and they wanted her to go on the internet, go on YouTube, go on podcasts. There were knockdown, drag out fights within the campaign as these young people who were operating off their personal feelings were conflicting with these older staffers who were looking at the data and understood well what kind of candidate they were dealing with. Uh, it it was a huge mess. I think people have to bear in mind, Trump, as unserious as he may strike people, Trump is simulating. He is exaggerating his personality and doing a bit, like a stand-up comic. It's a bit that not everyone likes, but it's a deliberate bit that he's doing purposefully. He's exaggerating elements of his temperament to produce a character that people will resonate with or find funny. And it doesn't have to be everybody, it just has to be enough for him to win. It's a kind of simulation. Harris engages in dissimulation. Harris is trying to hide various parts of herself because if you were exposed to those things, you wouldn't like what you would see. People can tell the difference between a politician who is simulating and a politician who is dissimulating. No politician is authentic. Every politician engages in rhetorical games. But people tend to gravitate toward a politician who looks like their public image is something they're purposefully making, as opposed to a politician whose public image is a defensive mechanism to try to protect. People can tell the difference. And that's really what creates a big gap in terms of how charismatic a politician is viewed by the public.
The sexism thing is an interesting charge, specifically in 2024. Whereas, like to me, it was a lot less interesting in 2016, since Kamala Harris actually does play up to, some of those things that we might vaguely call to be like, sexist stereotypes. So, like for example, I live in a neighborhood that's very working class, extremely immigrant, very, very non-white. And I would often like talk to people about how they're voting or whatnot. And one thing that was coming up a lot in 2024 that did not happen in 2016, they would make comments such as, can you imagine Kamala Harris like sitting down with Xi Jinping or sitting down with Putin? She just would be totally unable to handle it. They never made those kinds of comments in 2016, right? They would never say about Hillary Clinton, can you imagine her sitting down with a male leader? They didn't think that she would have an issue with it. Right. So it's not merely enough to point at, because now there's going to be a blame game against like, non-white voters and like they're sexist, like they came from other countries and they bring all this toxic baggage, blah, blah, blah. But that it doesn't strike me that way at all. She's kind of like the perfect storm of, all those accusations about DEI, right? Like, of course, there's a racist undertone and overtone to a lot of these comments, but at the same time, Biden, he did say, I'm going to choose a black female. And he chose the first black female that he thought wouldn't damage him. And then all throughout the last 4 years, he's sidelining her, right? He's saying, you have to not be in the public spotlight. We're going to give you a job that's like total garbage that you don't want to do, right? We're going to sort of like maybe ruin your chances of ever succeeding me in any kind of way. So of course, right, if you're going to view her as a DI candidate, and if you do have any kind of vaguely sexist feelings, well, doesn't she just play up to the stereotype of the woman that can't sit down with a world leader and sort of, lay down the law? So it is a very odd how like all those like liberal, values that we've been cultivating from the Obama coalition, all of that has been put to the test and was just totally rejected this time around.
And in fairness to the Biden administration, at the point at which they decided to sideline her, they already had good evidence of her
Mhm.
limitations from the 2020 primary campaign,
Yeah.
right? People may not remember, but in 2020, Harris, after getting an immediate bump in the polling when she first announced, because she was out in California and it was thought that she would be popular in California and that she would get a lot of positive attention from celebrities and media people. So there was a moment where there was serious consideration of, is Harris the person to potentially beat Bernie Sanders? What happened? Well, Harris flip-flopped about Medicare for all in public, very blatantly, and did it in a way that was very predictable. She said that she would eliminate private health insurance companies. And then when she was asked about whether she meant that, she immediately flipped on it. So within the span of a week, she completely destroyed trust, both with the left of the party and with the center of the party. And what happened? Her polling cratered. Within a month, she went from the high mark of her polling to the basement. And then she dropped out before Iowa that cycle. She didn't even make it to Iowa. A lot of other candidates that we don't think of as having been as successful in 2020 got further than Harris did in that cycle ultimately. Because while there was a lot of media buzz around her because of who she is and where she's from, when people actually listened to her talk, it was a no-go. So Biden, in saying he was picking her for reasons of race and gender, set her up to some degree to be viewed that way. But also, the issue was that there was no other primary candidate that ticked all of the boxes demographically that the Biden administration was looking to tick, because that's the way that the Democrats think about building voter coalitions. They think about it in terms of groups and races and sexes. That's how they construct their coalitions. They treat the public as examples of types, right? There was no other candidate in 2020 that they could obviously have grabbed. There were arguments for picking lots of other people politically, but they felt it was necessary to pick someone who would be a counterweight in an identitarian sense to Biden, and the only person from that race was Harris. So it wasn't done on the basis of any kind of substantive qualities that she has, any kind of substantive expertise. And this is why it was clear from such an early point that if people were looking at Harris as the young person who could succeed Biden, there were going to be problems with that.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we could talk about the incumbencies throughout basically 2024 and perhaps even prior, right? So obviously Macron lost ground in France. The AfD party in Germany made up a lot of ground, especially in East Germany. We have Modi's party and Modi's coalition lost a lot of ground in India. But the one exception, of course, is in Mexico, right? So technically, Claudia Sheinbaum, she's not the incumbent, but in the she in the same way that Kamala Harris is going to be perceived as the incumbent, she was perceived as the incumbent in by Mexico's electorate, and they were happy with the was it 2018 that he got elected, so 6 or so years of Lopez's administration. Of course, people complain about I don't know, maybe the treatment of the cartels. There might have been some other scandals in between, but generally speaking, voters were very happy with the direction that Mexico moved, and you see a lot of it is heavily left wing, right? It's about raising wages. It's about centralizing government control, but not in a way that is like disruptive to someone's personal life. It's more so we need to reiterate that we are the state, right? We are the ones in control. We are the ones that are going to set the terms of where this, how this country is going to conduct itself, and we're the ones responsible for either improving or damaging the standard of living. So we're going to act like it. Whereas, like in the United States, we're ceding more and more control to the private sector. In Mexico, it's been the opposite, at least in recent memory. I mean, beyond my diagnosis of this, like, what exactly do you think is the reason for this incumbency crisis, and why Mexico was able to not just come out of unscathed, but quite the opposite, the opposite direction, and the win, of course, is it's much more decisive than even the Trump win. The Trump win is like what he's going to be between 1 to 1.5% popular vote, right? He has 312 to 317 maybe electoral votes. That it's good, but it's not the kind of it's a blowout by American standards, but it's not a blowout by the standard in Mexico more recently. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and particularly by recent American standards, we
Hmm.
used to have more decisive elections than we've had in the last 30 years or so. But yes, on Mexico, I think a couple of things are at play. One is that in the case of Mexico, you still have a lot of state building going on. There is a question about whether the state exercises a monopoly on the legitimate use of force in Mexico. That question is regularly asked by the cartels that operate their own spheres of influence within Mexican territory, and regularly asked by many members of the Mexican police, the Mexican civil service, who are often asked to make difficult decisions about who to obey, who to listen to, whether to take a bribe to preserve their safety. It's a much more difficult situation for the state in general. And Mexican citizens understand this. And so the expectations for the state are not as high. The expectation for the state in Mexico is that the state be seen to be trying to fix this and to be seen to be making some kind of ground. But that's very different in terms of what it is that you would expect the state to do versus, say, one of these very rich European, North American democracies, where the expectation is that there's going to be 2% inflation. If it goes to 5 for a few months, people are going to rage at you, right? So there's a different expectation there. And then I think also it's worth bearing in mind that because in Mexico, state capacity is weaker, it was not possible for the Mexican state to impose a lot of COVID measures that were imposed in other places. And AMLO didn't even try. Some governments, they would make a point of trying to say, hey, don't do this stuff. And they might not have the capacity to enforce it, but they would still come out with some kind of legal insistence. Mexico was a fairly unusual case in this regard. AMLO really did not push COVID measures, really at all. And his position was that Mexico is a different kind of country with a different kind of economy and situation that requires a different approach. I'm not necessarily saying that that was the right thing to do or a good thing to do, but ultimately it seems to have worked politically better than we're seeing even in, say, India.
Before moving on to your book, just like one final comment on the election in general, because I mean, there were definitely some dark moments throughout the election. One of them, the most obvious one, I think has a less obvious dimension to it, is during the Kamala Trump debate, where Trump goes up there, he starts talking about Haitians eating cats and dogs, so on and so forth, right? I mean, whatever, right? We could say that's bullshit. At the same time, I think to me, it's not so much like, oh, Republicans can just be out and out, like really darkly racist now, and it's considered acceptable by the electorate. I think there's another dimension to it that wasn't really discussed, and that's Kamala Harris's response, which was, all right, so she laughed at it during the debate. Then she went on with all these like very posh, professional, like black groups, right? Like, black journalists, like these like very educated sort of maybe some of them would be of Haitian origin, but the one thing that she did not do, right? And I was just imagining how this would play out. She did not show up to Springfield, Ohio for any kind of rally. She would not ever dare to be caught dead with a bunch of Haitian migrants behind her. I mean, just imagine the picture. Kamala Harris speaking not with, posh black Americans, but a Haitian that came over here, let's say 6 months ago or a year ago or 2 years ago in a visa, thick accents, very, very dark skinned males, right? The kinds of things that, sorry to say, a lot of Americans, they do fear, right? They do because they live in segregated communities. If you're going to be living in a place that encourages segregation, right, through no fault of your own, you're going to develop, if not like, knee jerk, like outright bigotry, then you're just going to have like, I don't know, some sort of anxieties, right? When you see these kinds of pictures. And Kamala Harris knew better, right? She refused to do, to me, it would be the right thing, obviously, right? Show up to Springfield, do a rally, speak not with some sort of hyper educated Black American that's been, ensconced and protected by the system, but really these highly, highly vulnerable groups. They're give them the goddamn mic. Let a black man with super dark skin and a thick accent say something about his position. She would never ever do that because there is no space in the Democratic Party for those kinds of politics. Because if you don't offer anything to, let's say white voters who might be fearful, white voters who are, losing ground, like I'm sure, lots of people in Springfield, Ohio, right? They probably like whether or not, immigration is a part of the question, they probably do feel like, we need more resources than we're getting. And by not getting it, by not being able to provide that, by sort of feeding into this idea that there is this kind of like zero sum game where the migrants are going to take everything away from you. If you keep acting like the party that believes that, right, then voters will believe it, right? Democrats will believe it, just like Republicans will believe it. They're like, did you find that interaction like me to be like, okay, yeah, what Trump is saying is kind of dark, but Kamala Harris's response is, just as dark, if not darker, because she's supposed to be the one that is like staving off the worst of these kinds of excesses. But instead, while pretending to not be doing so, she is in fact feeding into it.
Yeah, part of the trouble with the Democrats is that the Democrats are inclusive with regard to race, but only insofar as your professional class, only insofar as you've been to college and you can talk like you've been to college. And their claim is that every group can produce those people, and those people can be Democrats. But if you're not one of those people, if you're working class, if you haven't been to college, if you don't speak the language, well, then the attitude is you better vote Democrat because otherwise those Republicans will torment you.
Mm.
And if you're not scared of the Republicans, well, then what are you, a fool? Are you stupid? What's wrong with you? There isn't really any kind of attempt to actually let people who are working class, people who haven't been to college, talk. We never see in American politics people without college degrees talking or given major platforms from which to speak. It just doesn't occur in either party. But it is more egregious insofar as it's the Democrats because they ostensibly claim to represent diversity, but really they only represent people with college degrees who are professionals, and increasingly college degrees professionals and who make more money. This has become, an untenable situation.
Hmm.
And this campaign, I thought, on both sides, was the most explicitly racist campaign I can remember. I've
Hmm.
been following politics a long time. I started when I was 8 during Gore Bush. I can't remember a campaign with this much overt, both sides assuming, operating from the premise that the way to reach voters is to speak to them as members of racialized groups. Barack Obama scolding black men for not
Hmm.
supporting a woman. Harris putting 3 weeks before the election on her website the proposal to do a forgivable business loan, but only for black people. It's only forgivable if you're black. Uh, the white dudes for Harris thing at the beginning. And people recently I've been seeing, especially progressives and people on the left, claiming that Harris didn't do identity politics. If
Hmm.
that's not doing identity politics, we're a very long way from not doing identity politics in this country.
Yeah,
Very long way.
I mean, it was a very failed kind of identity politics. Again, like, my neighborhood is so West Indian. Like, they're supposed to love Kamala Harris. Absolutely not, right? If they did not, if they did not swing Trump, many just like stayed home, right? And these are people that voted Biden, right? These are people that might have voted Clinton. Many people just stayed home, in some of these places. So, that was
Yeah.
a part.
People are
That was definitely
tired
part
of
of it.
being told. They're tired of being told that you have to vote for the Democrats or bad things will happen to you.
Hmm.
It's like a mob boss coming around to your house and saying, "You wouldn't want something bad to happen to this place, would you?
Hmm.
You better give me what you have to give me for me to protect you." And this
Yeah.
mob boss Democratic Party is really aggravating for people, and they're tired of that game.
And you sort of see how, the kind of entitlement from liberals, especially in 2024, was off the charts, much more so than 2016. I know liberals that know better, right? Liberals that, married to non-whites, liberals that have been liberals, their whole lives, lived in totally like non-segregated places, like people that went to, I don't know, like high school with me, right? And should know better. But I'd hear them say stuff like, "Oh, don't worry about the Arab and Muslim vote. They're going to come back to the party afterwards. Don't worry about, the Lebanese vote. They're going to come for Democrats anyway. Don't worry about it." And it's like, well, you have no evidence of saying this, but also it's a very weird set of expectations, right? And these are the expectations that come about specifically because you don't have any kind of analog in your own life where you would not vote for the other party, based on something like a war, right? Like, nobody's going to come, for example, to like flatten some area where you might still have relatives, and therefore that's going to be like, okay, that's a step too far for me. I can't vote for Kamala Harris because she just, bombed France, with a nuke, right? That's not going to happen, right? Kamala Harris is not going to sell, weapons illegally to, some, war criminal, that will like butcher your relatives, like, for the most part, right? If you're like a typical liberal voter. So that's not even like part of their imagination. They can't imagine a Lebanese person saying no. And, honestly, like, a part of me was like, I'm definitely not a Trump fan. I'm not happy with Trump's win, but I also can't deny that I feel a slight sense of relief at the fact that Trump was elected, because to me, the idea that Democrats could do what they did all for the past year, and especially run the kind of campaign that they ran and get away with it, that to me was really, really unacceptable. And I was at least proud to see that so many voters, right, Lebanese and others, said, we're actually going to leverage our vote. We're not going to simply do it because you're telling us to. That is like the first time that I've seen a demographic group in my lifetime so use like politics in that way, in the way that it's meant to be used. And to me, like, I don't know if there's like a sort of like a glimmering, like, little ray of hope there. But I don't know. Like, I was at least slightly relieved, with Trump's presidency, but at the same time, like, I'm not, I don't have any illusions about what's coming next.
Yeah, the Democrats who say that people have to come back to the Democrats operate from the premise that the Republican Party is white supremacist and that everyone agrees on this.
Hmm.
And it's simply not the case that everyone agrees on that. A very, very large number of people think that that is a narrative that the Democrats push to make them feel coerced into voting for the Democrats. to put them in a situation where either you're going to be devoured by a beast or you vote Democrat.
Mhm.
So that you have to vote Democrat regardless of whether the Democrats do anything for you at any point ever. And a lot of people are recognizing that as a bluff, as a tactic, and not as something that they're going to be sincerely convinced of. And one of the things that's interesting is that the people who are most persuaded that the Republican Party is white supremacist tend to be affluent white liberal Democrat voters
Mhm.
who are, as soon as somebody doesn't vote Democrat, willing to accuse them of being stupid, of being not even, oftentimes subhuman. They're willing to very quickly dehumanize and speak in a very, very cruel way about people because it really is. It's a threat. The
Mhm.
Republicans exist for the Democrats to be a stick, a threat that can be used to extract votes from people. And this is going the other way as well. I mean, we are increasingly hearing Republicans use this kind of inflammatory rhetoric about Democrats and the threat ostensibly that Democrats pose to people. It's both parties that are increasingly relying on fear narratives to extract voter participation. But I think in this particular election, because of the weaknesses of Harris as a candidate and the lack of any kind of positive case, the Trump supporters, they often think that Trump is going to do particular things. They have hopes, not just fears. Their hopes are ill-founded in various ways, and we could get into all the different things that they hope Trump will do and what's actually likely to happen. But in his case, at least it's not just a fear narrative. There is something he has said or something he has persuaded them to think that he will positively do beyond protect them from the Democrats.
I have a few more election things to talk about, but maybe we should leave that for the paywall. Allan Lichtman and his 12, whatever it wasn't, it wasn't 12 keys, maybe it was 17 keys, whatever it was. There's a few dozen keys to the White House, which I think did in fact work to predict the Trump election, but Allan, for whatever reason, misapplied his keys. And maybe we'll talk about that after the paywall comes down. Also, the idea of like this retreat, right? I feel like there's like a retreat of liberals now. They're much more open to the idea that Trump is a legitimate president. You have people like Joe Scarborough, Mika Brzezinski. They're now like trying to form an alliance with Trump. These like never Trumpers are sort of like coming back into the fold. And this kind of like speaks to some elements in the latter portions of your book that we're going to talk about. But let's leave the rest of the election stuff for later and get into your book now, questions of legitimacy. So what is the core argument of legitimacy in liberal democracies?
Yeah, so I think that for a long time, there's been this premise that if society and the state come apart, if the values of society and the values of the state become estranged, that this will result in some kind of showdown between society and the state. And either the state will make concessions to society, or the state will repress society, or society will overcome in a revolution the state. And this thinking of the state and society as unitary things that are either aligned or they're apart, I think it was very common in kind of mid to late 20th century political theory of many different types. But I think part of what has happened in the United States and in the UK and in a few other countries is that as these democracies have lasted a very long time and all sorts of other regimes have come and go in other parts of the world, there is a sense that I think a lot of people have that there isn't an obvious other political system that they can do. That if they were to stage a revolution or if they were to try to overthrow the government and replace it with something else, that even if they could do it, could they impose any kind of new system that would be any better? There's a lack of confidence that this is the case. And so because there's this lack of confidence, even when people become very disgruntled with the way that the state is operating, they don't behave the way that they would have behaved 70 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago. They don't challenge the state in some kind of organized way because they're not confident that they'll accomplish anything by doing that. And so one of the consequences of this is that levels of disagreement that previously would have produced revolution, mass demonstrations, maybe civil conflict, no longer have that resolved. And so instead, these disagreements are allowed to continue to grow and develop and to go deeper and deeper and deeper and to affect more and more parts of both the state and society. And they're able to produce all of these lines of balkanization that are not they don't have to become hard, but they're soft lines, and they're constantly being reconfigured and redrawn. And part of what happens now is that anytime you try to change anything, you're always representing too small a slice of the population. There's always too few people who agree with you, and there's always too many disagreements, not just between you and people who obviously would seem to oppose you from the opposite side of the political spectrum, but also within your own camp. There's loads of tiny little petty disagreements that get in the way of coming together to do anything. And as these disagreements spill out and spill out and spill out, it makes it harder and harder for the state to act in any particular direction without producing an enormous amount of upset. At this point, whenever any politician does almost anything that's major, it strikes people as authoritarian. It strikes people as acting without the consensus, without the consent of the governed. It strikes people as unrepresentative, as an attack on their liberty, as something which is unequitable, that violates meritocracy properly understood, right? All of these different values get kicked up all the time to challenge almost anything anybody does. And so what I am kind of talking about in this book is this crisis of liberal democracy that is very different from the way it's typically portrayed, right? The way that a lot of people in our media have talked about, say, Trump, is that Trump threatens democracy, or that there's going to be some kind of rebellion, civil war, violent breakup of the United States, some kind of showdown of some kind where there will be major changes. What I think is really going on is that the disagreement has penetrated so deeply, so many different areas of life now, that we have a very, very difficult time actually coming together to do anything. And as soon as somebody wins the presidency, what we immediately start to notice is that even within their own coalition, even within their own plane, there are people who sharply disagree with each other who are immediately treating each other as potential enemies. We're seeing this right now with the Trump administration on the plane. I mean, the Trump administration hasn't even formed yet. And people are leaking negative things about Elon Musk. People inside the Trump plane are going, Elon Musk thinks he's in charge because he donated $100 million. Who does he think he is? And Javier Milei comes along and takes a photo with Trump and Musk and cuts Musk's thumbs up out of the photo. There's already this internecine stuff. And during the previous Trump administration, there were all these books about the internecine fighting between the Steve Bannon alt-right and the Reince Priebus establishment Republicans and the Jared Kushner soft Democrat members of Trump's family. And all of this stuff immediately gets in the way. Trump tried to do a bunch of tariffs in the first term, and immediately a bunch of senators like Rand Paul were threatening to take away the tariff power because they don't believe in tariffs. They're free trade guys. So these disagreements have just become more and more and more common. And because people don't believe that there's some alternative system that they can just impose, they constantly are looking for ways to gently reform democracy to make it work a little better. They think if they change some of the procedures around a little bit, that maybe it'll work a little better. But this isn't really the case. This is, in fact, a symptom of their unwillingness to do the more dramatic kinds of things that would actually propel change.
Do you think there's any kind of possibility of Trump himself? Because I mean, like the whole notion of the book, right, is that there's this kind of like there's like a complex relationship between dynamic sort of like forms of government versus a stasis, and we are kind of like in a stagnant sort of stasis now. Do you think Trump represents a is it just kind of like a desperate attempt to break through the stasis, or is this simply like the veneer of change? Whereas, like, in the background, we see like, photos right now, right? Chuck Schumer and Trump, right? Laughing with each other, cutting some sort of deals. Is this just kind of like another means of perpetuating the stasis that we've been dealing with? But just like, by switching out the aesthetics, like it just looks different. By saying something like, oh, these like liberal ideals that we've had, such as DEI, and now we have this backlash. Now we'll see genuine change, when in fact, like, obviously Trump in the classic sense, he is more or less as liberal as Harris, right? Like there's not going to be, like, to me, it doesn't seem like there's going to be these dramatic changes, right? America is built upon, small L liberalism as it's been understood for at least a couple of centuries. That does not seem like it's going to really change anytime soon.
Yeah, I think that it's difficult to try to get into what does Trump actually intend, what does he actually believe and want. But one thing we can see pretty clearly at this point is that even when politicians come in saying that they want to do a lot of change, as soon as they concretize that change and it comes to mean something in particular, the something in particular is always much more controversial than the notion of change in its preconceptualized abstract form. Take Obama, for instance, right? Change in 2008, hugely popular because lots of people can see that the system is not working, right? But as soon as you concretize change as the Affordable Care Act and the stimulus program, now it draws an enormous amount of opposition because the specifics, how do we understand what's actually going on? We have no way of generating a consensus among American society as a whole about what the fundamental character of our problems is. And as soon as anybody tries to offer an account, immediately they're set upon from all directions, not just by people on, say if you're on the left, set upon by people on the right, but within the left itself, who will say, no, no, the way you're understanding the problem is all wrong. We shouldn't be doing this. We should be doing that instead. No, no, the values that you have are all wrong. The way that you're understanding your values is all wrong. And so on the cover of the book, I've got a copy, right? I have this Hydra with all these different heads. So as a democracy goes through embeddedness, all of the different values that we think of as the things that in principle unite a democracy, a commitment to liberty and a commitment to equality, a commitment to representation, or maybe to democracy as a value in itself, all of these different abstractions are pitted against each other and they balkanize themselves into a plurality of conflicting conceptualizations. So liberty comes to mean many different things that all conflict. Equality comes to mean many different things that all conflict. Same goes for representation. And then also there are various other values that people appeal to that are outside of those liberal values, things like family, things like prosperity, things like peace, things like order. These are other things that people in liberal democracies do care about, even if they're not specifically liberal abstractions. And so the consequence of this is that when you start actually talking about what do you want the state to do, everybody's coming at that question from a different direction. And I like to think of this as a huge hydra that has wandered into a tar pit. It's wandered into this big problem, this global system that we're in. And it's very difficult to sort this system out, navigate it, or move within it. And what is happening is that there's this frothing competition of different narratives, different legitimation stories and ideological narratives. It's a legitimation story if you agree with it. It's an ideological narrative if you don't, about why it is that the state should do various different things. And there's this constant frothing of the heads and the moving around of the heads. They're banging into each other. They're attacking each other. But the actual body of the thing is in a tar pit. The body of the thing is not really going anywhere. And all of this screeching and yelling that's occurring on top, it's not really going anywhere. But the one thing that it is doing is it allows the thing, the beast, to continue to, eat food and breathe air and drink water. These heads, these necks are able to pull on resources from various different directions. So even though the thing is stuck in this tar pit, it doesn't die immediately as a consequence of this. But the more heads you get, the harder it is for the heads to possibly imagine actually extracting the thing from the pit. Right? The heads can pull on resources that are around the pit from many different directions, but it becomes harder and harder to actually move the whole creature out of the bad situation that it's in.
I think a microcosm of maybe not the Hydra, but at least like some of that concept is just how Kamala Harris ran her campaign, right? At a certain point, it was all these competing narratives that it's like, okay, you lop one off and then there's another one, right? Now it's like it's like we're gonna be, the pro-black, right, party, right? Like we stand against the murder of George Floyd. That was in 2020. 2024, it's top prosecutor running for office, and she has cops of the DNC, right? On the one hand, and like, Elon Musk got a lot of criticism, I think, rightfully so, for running those dueling ads, like in Michigan, for example, like for Jewish voters, it was like Kamala Harris is like stands with Palestine. Do you stand with Palestine and Kamala Harris? Whereas like, Muslim voters would get, she stands with Israel. Do you stand with Kamala Harris? But she herself actually did the same exact targeting, also based on who the voters would be. right? She would, on the one hand, talk about Palestinian rights, and then on the other hand, we will allow Israel to essentially do whatever it wants. All these competing narratives, and but just no sense that this is all leading to something bigger, right? To any kind of synthesis, right? That's kind of like the whole point of the Hydra, right? It's not meant to have necessarily any kind of synthesis. It's meant to writhe in that tar pit as you describe it. And speaking of which, so like, do you think that there's an argument to be made that so like if in the book like you draw this distinction between politicians who run as de facto revolutionaries, but then they govern as settlers, meaning they try to get the voters to settle for what they are able to get, such as, like Trump tariffs, like, yeah, totally saved the working class, right? So vote for me, right? Because I finally did it. Right. I finally, began to reindustrialize America. Vote for me, vote for me. Um, do you think there's an argument to be made that Trump can only run as a revolutionary but cannot actually win as an incumbent? Because so far, right, he did run against a de facto incumbency when he beat Hillary Clinton, but then as an incumbent, right, which of course, like, things out of control under his administration, probably, I assume there's going to be a repeat of that. Do you think that he's just incapable of winning as anything other than a revolutionary and losing as an incumbent?
I don't know if I'd go so far as to say incapable, but I do think incumbency is increasingly a disadvantage because of this need to try to sell whatever it is that you've done, right? Trump says he's going to do these tariffs, and then actually he didn't do nearly as much in the way of tariffing as he wanted to do because he was scared of the Republicans in the Senate. And then when COVID hit, he had to back away from a lot of the tariffs because he was concerned about the economy heading into the election year. Nevertheless, he has to act like these tariffs saved American industry, revitalized the working class. He has to have this kind of narrative. And that narrative is more obviously false than the narrative of, hey, I'm going to help. I know things, right? So when you're outside, you could say, hey, I'm going to help. I'm good at this. I know stuff. I'm competent. And people may believe that, but it's harder when you actually have done certain concrete things that people can talk about. The lowest point of Trump's first term in terms of popularity was the period in 2017 when he was trying to repeal and replace the ACA and when he was doing the tax cut, because those were concrete policies, concrete actions that he was associated with. And similar to the actions that Obama took in the first year of his presidency, they were very controversial actions that did not deliver on the promise of what many of the people who had been attached to the campaign were envisioning when they decided to become attached. So, yeah, I do think it becomes harder as an incumbent in this situation because it's hard to get people to settle. And this is one of the big questions going forward. Will that at some point change? Will people start to expect less from these very rich democratic states? Will they become more like people in other parts of the world who have lower expectations for their governments because they have no exposure to something like the post-war world where you had growth rates of 5% a year, and you had the construction of healthcare systems, the building of universities and highways and railroads. Will we forget about that? And I'm not saying, by the way, that we can go back to that. I'm not saying that you can just return to that kind of period. But what that period did do for us is it created certain expectations in us about an American dream and what it should involve or mean, about a European standard of living and what that should involve or mean, that are very difficult to get rid of. Politicians have a very difficult time getting us to settle for an image of the world that is more like 1920 in terms of level of economic inequality, in terms of the rate of economic growth, in terms of how much influence you might be able to have over what goes on.
Can you define, because you mentioned it here a couple times, what is deep pluralism, and does it necessarily lead to the kinds of polarization that we see in America? Do you think deep pluralism is a system that is usable for like some sort of like any kind of like ideal scenario for a nation state that you might have in your head, right? Different from the one that we have. Can deep pluralism really play a role there, or is there something there that's like antithetical to, if not like human nature, then at least the ways that we've been structuring societies?
Yeah, deep pluralism is both an advantage and a disadvantage that embedded democracies acquire, right? So what deep pluralism really is it is this possibility of disagreement going deeper and becoming more extensive than at any previous point in human history. Earlier on in human history, when you get very sharp, intractable disagreements, people use force to resolve those differences. They reach a point where they go, well, we disagree too much to talk to each other and convince each other of anything. We are too much at odds with each other for a discussion to resolve the disagreement. Therefore, we will resort to force. We don't do that. We don't go, oh, we disagree, therefore we will resort to force. We have knowledge of the world wars. We have knowledge of nuclear weapons. We have knowledge of the American Civil War. Because we have been through all of these horrible experiences historically, we are very, very skittish about trying to use force to resolve disagreements. So the disagreement goes much deeper and becomes much more embedded even in things like knowledge production. What does it mean to tell the truth? How do we distinguish between real knowledge and fake knowledge? How do we know whether science is real? How do we know whether someone has expertise? How do we evaluate a claim that somebody makes? We disagree even about things like that increasingly. So this disagreement is on the one hand helpful because it means that you don't get violence and war and death and carnage when people disagree, but it's also unhelpful because it creates coordination problems. It makes it difficult to actually act on the basis of something like a consensus. So if you have a political system which is predicated on the possibility of getting consensus, and liberal democracies to varying degrees are predicated on this, deep pluralism is going to create a state capacity problem. But that's a very different problem from the problem people think about when you use a term like polarization. They think about a problem like, say, Weimar Germany in the 30s. They think about a problem where you might have a Nazi or communist regime established, or where you might get a civil conflict. Deep pluralism protects against that at the price of introducing an immobility that is very difficult to resolve, because historically, if you had dysfunctional institutions, how would you solve the problem? You would create new institutions. How would you make new institutions? You would engage in some kind of extra legal act. You would do something collectively with other people together. You'd go on a general strike. You would have a coup. You would do something like that. If you can't do that, if you can only change the system within the parameters of the system that already exists, and that system is designed in such a way that its parameters can only be changed when you obtain a social consensus, and the social consensus has been made impossible by deep pluralism, now you have a path dependency and you're locked into a framework which doesn't allow you to move.
I also just realized that we did not define embedded democracy. So just, I guess, briefly discuss that and what happens when democracies shift from new to embedded, and maybe some comments on democracies that you see like in the future that are like on their way to becoming embedded and what that might mean.
Yeah, an embedded democracy has been around long enough that the imaginations of the people who live in that democracy have contracted a bit. In most democracies that get going, there's a memory of a time before democracy. And you'll have a generation that was, 20 years old in an authoritarian system that existed before the democracy was established. And that generation will always have a certain nostalgia for the previous regime because it was young and happy and doing stuff and enjoying the prime of life in the authoritarian context. So you have to get to a point where you don't have any living memory of any other kind of system. And then it also helps if in other parts of the world, other systems have been tried and they've not been successful, right? And in the case of something like the United States, you have a case where what does it mean to be American? Well, there is no notion of what it means to be American outside of a commitment to the American Revolution, the Constitution, the political system. In terms of, the people in the United States, they speak different languages. They look different ways. They have lots of differences among them. What they share a commitment to, if anything, is some notion of American citizenship, the rights that come out of that. So it becomes very difficult to even have a shared notion of Americanness outside of some political conception. And that makes it very difficult to radically change the political conception. It seems like an attack on being American itself to try to do that, right? In France, there are French Republicans and there are French monarchists, and there are several different types of French Republicans and French monarchists, but they all recognize each other as French because they don't think of being French as about being either a monarchist or a Republican. Both of those things are compatible with Frenchness as they understand it, right? In the case of Britain, it's less a positive identification with a British system than it is this Winston Churchill argument that democracy is the worst form of government except for all others that have been tried. The British attitude is, well, look at what happened in France and in Germany and in the Soviet Union and in these other places when they tried to do other stuff. You don't want to see that kind of stuff happen, do you? There's a pessimism about what's possible in British thought, in British political theory. These are the kinds of things that produce embeddedness, a pessimism about what's possible, a sense that people have tried other kinds of idealistic things and they have not worked out. And this agedness, this lack of any living memory of a different system being applied locally.
And so these future states that you name, a couple dozen or so that might be underway to an embedded democracy, do you just imagine it's just going to kind of like replicate, like just structurally speaking, the same problems that we're dealing with now? Do you see something else going on? Like, is this just kind of like the way that liberalism is going, or what?
Yeah, I think in a lot of states, if the democracy is younger, there's a real concern on the part of the leadership that if they make mistakes, that there could be a revolution or there could be backsliding or something like that. And this is something that I think we see very clearly in, Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, there's large numbers of people who were 20 years old in an authoritarian state who have fond memories of that. There is a lot of uncertainty about whether those people will ultimately want liberal democracy or whether they'll want some other kind of regime. The European Union is concerned about managing the transition toward liberal democracy in all of these states, and it's worried about backsliding, and it pays close attention to elections in Poland and Hungary and some of these other states, right? I think that one of the things that has changed is that because the Soviet Union collapsed, there is a much stronger sense now that there isn't some other way to go. And some people have tried to frame Putinism or the Chinese political system as a different way to go, but we're not seeing large numbers of people in democracies gravitating toward that. Although some people might make arguments in Eastern Europe that Putinism has a certain level of tractability, depending on whether you regard the right in these Eastern European countries as being Putinite or Putinist. But I do think that we're seeing more states get to a point where they can't really imagine a different political system helping them or serving them any better. And where the horizon of possibility is modest reforms to the electoral system, to the way people vote, to campaign finance laws, maybe to the structure of the branches of government. Occasionally you'll see people call for things like abolishing the Senate or getting rid of judicial review or the Federal Reserve. But these policies sound outlandish to most people. Even these things, which are very modest reforms, if you think about democracy as a concept and all of the different things that have been done to change our democracies over the last 200 years, right? These are very modest proposals compared with a lot of what people have done. And they're not very popular. If you poll people on getting rid of the Senate, you won't find very much support for that. You won't find very much support for getting rid of the Supreme Court. You won't find very much support for making the president really powerful. Even within members of the president's own party, typically speaking, 2/3 will say that they think it would make the situation worse if the president became more powerful.
Mm-hmm. Since you already brought up Russia and China, I wanted to just like briefly discuss legitimation and legitimacy in not in liberal democracies as you would have it in the book, but legitimation in some like more autocratic regimes, right? So again, China and Russia, because it does strike me that, and this is just kind of like a function, I guess, of both the newness of some of their experiences as well as some of the catastrophes that these populations have lived through. But it does seem to me like they're having a much easier time with legitimacy and legitimation than liberal democracies. And I don't think it's sufficient to say, well, of course they would, right? It's autocratic, right? That's just like necessarily part of the system. I think it has to do much more so with the fact that liberal democracies have become much more stagnant rather than anything else, right? It's not simply that we have deep pluralism and therefore, right, we have all this fake news and people are confused. Like, I don't think it's really about that. When I see, like something like Putin's Russia, just 30 years ago, right? If you were around in 1994, that is just such a totally different experience for a Russian than it is post Putin. China, like even in 1994, you look at the skyline in Shanghai versus skyline today. Obviously, right? Like, I mean, just imagine being born in that era versus seeing everything around you. When I think of like my great grandparents, like my great grandmother is born into a peasant society, and by the time that she has, entered her early 20s, she is living now in a nuclear armed superpower, right? That is an amazing set of transitions, and that's going to really, really, really get legitimation right on the side of the state. It's going to be very easy to do legitimation. It's easy for Xi Jinping to do legitimation, even if like, I mean, like if you ever go in China, like you notice like on the TVs, right? They have Mandarin, they have standard Mandarin, all over the closed captions, and that's because much of the population, right? They speak like what are essentially all different languages that are not mutually intelligible. And despite all these things that should be obstacles, it really doesn't seem to matter as much as being able to change people's conditions. So like I wonder if you have like any like extended commentary on legitimation outside of liberal democracies and what that might mean for liberal democracies going forward.
Yeah, if you don't have a liberal democracy, then you don't have as straightforward a narrative about how people are involved in the decisions that are being made. So it becomes much more important that it look like the decisions are helping them or benefiting them. So legitimation tends to be more in terms of output. Are you actually getting economic growth? Are you having success in foreign policy? And it becomes much more results oriented, which in one sense makes the system more fragile, right? It's more fragile because if for whatever reason, whatever contingent reason, you have a major setback, or even just the appearance of a major setback, the legitimation can evaporate very quickly and you can have huge problems, right? And yet at the same time, because the states have an awareness that they can have these huge problems, they have to work very, very hard to ensure that they continue to deliver on results. So in some ways, the fragility of a system makes it more dynamic. The fact that the system will fall if it seems to get bad results, or at least that the leaders believe that it really could fall, disciplines them and causes them to try harder to get good results. So even if their institutions are less optimized for getting good results in various ways, because there is a genuine concern about regime collapse, they work much harder and much more consistently to get growth. They think in a more long-term way as a consequence of that. In the West, it's in part because we are secured against revolt by the shrinking of the imaginarium, by our population's lack of willingness and capacity to organize together and do things, right? That the state doesn't have to deliver on results to anything like the same degree. So I would say that it's the weakness of the legitimation mechanisms of authoritarian states right now that is compelling them to be more results oriented. And it's the strength of liberal democratic structures in terms of legitimation and narrative that is allowing them to underperform in terms of results. And this is one of the curious things about all of this. It's very contradictory. And sometimes to have a system that in the long run performs as well as it possibly can, you need a certain level of dysfunction. Sometimes dysfunction is functional in a larger and sometimes more important sense. And this is something that we have lost sight of. We have become too good at preventing people from rebelling. We've become too good at keeping people in line. And when you get too good at that, you stop having to deliver on stuff.
Mhm. I want to briefly talk about your notions of kind of like because one thing you do is you critique the notion of trying to establish politics or political thought either with or without using morality, right? Like sometimes there's like a way to sidestep that, or people want to sort of like leapfrog past it, or introduce morality after the fact while starting with a kind of like a moral set of premises. And you might have comments on that, but immediately when I was reading it, I actually was just thinking of like some counterpoints that immediately came to mind. Like, for example, John Mearsheimer, he has this whole theory about international relations, right? We have an anarchic state of politics, right? State of affairs where, nation states are competing with one another for survival. They're willing to destroy one another for the sake of survival. Survival is the bottom line. And that is very much an amoral system, right? It kind of like taps into ideas of, I don't know, like natural selection and whatnot, right? It could have maybe some of those grisly kind of overtones from, centuries past, but I don't think it necessarily has to go that way. Like you could begin with an amoral system that is all about survival, and yet you used the phrase path dependency before. Through path dependency, you essentially end up in a situation where you reintroduce morality after the fact, and it seems to me like it's kind of seamless and logical. Like one thing that would surprise people if they know about Mearsheimer's politics is he says things like, international law doesn't matter, right? Which to us, would be considered like, an amoral stance. It doesn't matter in the sense that if states believe that their survival is at stake, of course they will ignore international law for the sake of placating their sense of survival. Fine. But at the same time, he is not at all even close to being against international law. He's a huge supporter of international law, and he believes that any violations of international law, even by regional or world hegemons, he doesn't believe they're world hegemons anymore, but even if you do have a world hegemon, any violation of international law is extremely costly. If Israel violates international law by doing the kinds of things that it does, that is obviously damaging to its economy. It is damaging to its long-term survival. If America violates international law, that is very damaging to us in the sense that nobody can really trust us. Like we can't be trusted as an honest broker in the Middle East. We can't be trusted as some sort of, like when we pontificate about Russian aggression because we do the same exact thing, right? And we often do it in a way that's much more savage than when Putin has done in Ukraine. So none of that is taken seriously, right? American power erodes. Morality seems to come about, right, rather seamlessly after the fact. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on this kind of counterintuitive transition, right? Because again, we are starting from an amoral frame, and yet we're ending up, with like a very kind of like Alex Sheremet view of, international like law. Like you have to follow it. This is why, right? Like you end up being kind of like a stickler and a nag, even if you begin from those premises.
Yeah, so I would challenge a little bit the idea that the commitment to survival is amoral, the kind of Hobbesian view that we ought to do what our fear is motivating us to do, or that we ought to do what we think will make for order or for peace. I don't think is amoral. I think that those are values that people have. People put value on the maintenance of order, the maintenance of peace. And I think that those values should be taken seriously as political values that are very important to many people. They're not always the most important to everyone. And, when I used to teach political theory at Cambridge, I like to introduce people to what I call the Hobbes-Gandhi scale. So on the one side, you have Hobbes. Hobbes is completely committed to survival and to doing whatever is necessary to survive. And he says you should give on any other values that you have, insofar as those values conflict with your survival. Because if you don't survive, you can't do anything. You can't have anything. Therefore, you should always put survival first. Gandhi has completely the opposite view. He's willing to be killed over almost anything to stick by the values that he considers important, because he has a very spiritual attitude to all of this stuff and thinks that ultimately, if you prioritize the survival of your body over God, the truth, the good, love, that this is the greatest possible betrayal of what is human that you could engage in, right? Now, very few people in practice are willing to do anything the government says to survive, no matter how inconvenient it is. And also, very few people are in practice willing to be killed over any principle, regardless of how small it might be. Most people are somewhere in between these two positions. They have different values, some to do with order, peace, survival, some to do with love, truth, the good, what it is that they care about, liberty, equality, other kinds of things. And we see all the time that when people engage in revolutionary action, that people engage in trade-offs. They go, okay, there's some risk that if I do this, I might not survive, but these values that I have, I think are important, and therefore I will put myself at risk to pursue these values. And other people will make other calculations about the same situations, right? Politics is very much about the art of making these very difficult calculations and deciding in very challenging moments what values to put first, how to understand your values, how to concretize those values in terms of action. And it's very easy to miscalculate, to end up dead or to end up alive, but in a situation that strikes you as horrifying, as very much not in accordance with your values at all, to the point where people choose death. They commit suicide over the situation that they've ended up in, which, by the way, used to be very common in certain political cultures. If we think about, say, Japan or ancient Rome, the idea that the situation would be so bad that you would kill yourself over it is something that was common. Deliberately kill yourself. And many people implicitly kill themselves by adopting bad lifestyle habits when they get into situations that conflict too much with their values that they can't actually live with. So I would emphasize that the values that Mearsheimer and the realists talk about in terms of order maintenance, in terms of peace maintenance and survival are important human values, but don't have a total monopoly on human value. And so a lot of what's going on in politics is that people are going to make different arguments about what the state should do on the basis of different values. To maintain peace, the state should do this. To maintain order, the state should do that. To maintain liberty, to maintain equality. Not only do these things conflict with each other, but people will often understand these abstractions in conflicting ways. So you can say, well, what does peace require? And within the realist camp in IR, there are often meaningful disagreements that different realist theorists will have with each other about what best maintains order, what best maintains peace, right? So Mearsheimer will say Israel shouldn't be violating international law because in the long term, that will put its survival in jeopardy by alienating it from potential supporters around the world. But you will find realists in Israel who think that Israel has to do this. And if it doesn't do it, it will be endangered, or it thinks that actually it has support from the relevant allied states in the Gulf to do this, and that really is its audience. And what the Western college students think has nothing ultimately to do with the survival of the state. These are very different views. They're very conflicting. And it would be really difficult if we put those two people, one with the first kind of Mearsheimer view and the other with maybe a Netanyahu type view in the same room. They could have an argument that's entirely about order and what's necessary to maintain order in the area. And they could invoke no other values at all but order and still never agree with each other about what order actually requires from the Israeli state. And it's these kinds of intractable disputes, even within camps that seem like they ought to agree because they care about the same abstract value, that I think is really marking contemporary politics.
Yeah, and I mean that would be like one of the frustrating things, right? Like, I mean, even if we take at face value some of those, let's say, realist Israeli arguments, like our audience is really the Gulf states and these kingdoms. Well, I mean, even from that perspective, right? My response would be, well, yeah, but those Gulf states, like even if they are dictatorships, like or kingdoms or whatever, they still have to very much worry about the feelings of the population. And people are always talking about the coming collapse of Iran, but Jordan could just as more quickly collapse because of this. Like the Egyptian population is fairly different from the de facto Sisi puppet, right? Like and those are the kinds of dangers that are not being paid attention to. But yeah, I agree. Like from pure like values
Yeah.
first, like you start with the values, but the details, like how we're going to interpret it, like my comments right now, right? I think they're the realistic take on the situation, but Israeli realists might not.
Right. And that's not to say that I agree or don't agree with either of the particular views, but just to highlight the levels of argument that can be had and the amount of disagreement that can be had, even among people who ostensibly want the same thing, which is just peace in the region and for people to not die.
Well, before the paywall comes down, I just want to make sure that we discuss at least the end of your book, where you go into what happens, right, in the politics of despair and how people often recede into if they can't do politics anymore, right? Maybe they recede into fandoms, maybe they recede into family and family values. Like you see that all the time, like fuck this, I'm never doing this again. Well, all that matters is me and my family, right? Like you hear that all the time, right? It's throughout history. You hear it today. We're seeing it now, right? With everybody kind of like backing out from the liberal project. MSNBC is like going through a real tough time right now. Like they're losing tons of subscribers because like they've been told for the past 4 years that Trump is a dictator and he's never going to be in office again, blah, blah, blah. And then this happened. So this is like a common thing. I'm hearing anecdotes about everybody that's like been like on like leftist podcasts or whatever that do these kinds of shows. They're losing subscribers because people just are checked out. And one of the things that you mention as like a potential area to recede into is fandoms, right? This could be the arts, it could be art adjacent, but very often, I think in America, what you see is they're fandoms in the literal sense of like adults that watch Marvel movies, 40-year-old women that are into hot vampires or Harry Potter books, that sort of thing that has like a very steep sort of corporatist sheen to it. So maybe you could talk about that, and then we could talk about like the arts proper, because I think that's a counterpoint to maybe some of the ways that people think about fandoms and think about culture in general. I think they're very distinct. So why don't you give us your ideas on that first?
Yeah, people start looking for other ways of realizing their values or other ways of seeing their values portrayed when they're not able to get politics to express them. So if the state won't act on the basis of your values the way you understand them, maybe you can make a family that will be able to operate on the basis of those values. Or maybe you can join a religious organization, a faith-based organization that is committed to those values. Maybe there is some entertainment company, entertainment media that you feel espouses your values or allows you to see them depicted in fiction. Or maybe there is some kind of a futurist tech possibility of your values being realized in the future, maybe somewhere else, maybe on a different planet, somewhere else. If you support technological development, maybe you'll reach a point at which that becomes possible. So people make commitments to these other kinds of things. But one of the points that I emphasize in that chapter is that each of these other spaces is structured very much by political considerations. Because to sustain these different spaces, you do have to have a system of generating resources for these different forms. There is an industry around maintaining family structures. There's industry around maintaining religious organizations. And then, of course, tech companies, entertainment companies, very much. There's a political economy and a ton of money to be made from these promises about other worlds, whether they're fictional worlds or future worlds or some hybrid of the two in the case of sci-fi, right? So the point that I want to emphasize here is that when people go to these other spaces thinking that they're getting away from politics, oftentimes they're entering into a different organizational type that they have not yet fully understood. And often the way that organization works involves some kind of economic stultifying logic that recapitulates many of the same problems that the person was facing when they were thinking about politics writ large. So in the case of families, it becomes very difficult to get enough resources to actually build a diverse array of different family types. And you'll see people who will go, well, people in the old days, they used to have kids no matter how many resources they had. Well, sure, but then the level of different kinds of values that you're going to be able to have and experience and realize within the family will be greatly limited by the lack of resources. It's the resources that gives you choices, meaningful choices about how to run the family, about how to operate it. And if you just have kids in a low resource situation, then your options become much more limited and your ability to make different kinds of young people becomes much more limited, right? So you can continue to engage in that space, but it won't deliver for you the promise that it would if you actually had access to the necessary level of resources so that you could make decisions about how the family or how the household, because it doesn't have to be understood in a traditional sense, how the household would operate. And the same is true in all of these other zones. And people will come into something like fandoms, often looking for something like art, looking for art as a different way of engaging with reality. And what they'll find is that this access to art is increasingly corporatized and mediated through these very expensive production and distribution systems. And to be able to just engage in it at the level of the beautiful, at the level of the sublime, at the level of what might be true is very, very difficult. And instead, this process of what some might regard as infantilization tends to occur. Instead, we get this very, very mediatized, corporatized art. And we get entertainment companies engaging in politics, trying to use the art to make political statements or
Mhm.
signal things politically. And people end up trying to realize culture war positions by petitioning entertainment companies to make certain kinds of art that cater to preconceived notions of the human. So it all becomes very challenging. And so when people try to get away from all of this, they often just end up right back in the same place. And all of these arguments that you might have about liberty, equality, order, prosperity, peace, you can have all these arguments about what a family is or ought to be. What
Mhm.
is a real church supposed to do? What is real art? What is an actual vision of the future that is worthy of the human species? You can have endless arguments about all of these things, and the deep pluralism can infect all of these zones.
And that kind of corporatism, it really does cut both ways. Yes, like in the last few years, it's trended what is like at least aesthetically, left. Like I don't really consider, putting a black square for George Floyd to be like leftist activism, right? To me, it's bullshit. And the bullying, related to it, like you didn't put a black square, like that, that to me is not leftism. But it happens on both sides in the sense that like for a long time, right, the kind of like liberal response to dead white males was, we need to have other kinds of poets. We need to have other kinds of artists, which I'm all for, right? Especially since like many of these dead white males, I don't consider them to be very talented writers. Like, not to say that, for example, Shakespeare isn't talented, but to me, even in his own time period, Shakespeare to me is not, the best poet of his day, right? So I'm all for that kind of diversification, and yet when you see what the diversification brought, it's just replicating, many of the same problems of dead white males into just kind of like a different color. Like recently, like in the last couple of weeks, I received some sort of like totally, asinine comment on an essay that I wrote like 10 years ago, a book review, Gail Jones's The Healing. In fact, the book was so bad, I had forgotten that I read it. I forgot that I even wrote a review of it. I was only reminded it exists because somebody left a comment, right, chiding me for taking a negative review as a white person on this book. And it's like, I've given you, and I've given so much support to like great, like non-white writing, great black writing, great black art, but nobody actually really cares, right? They, to them, it's kind of like, it is like purely a fan of. It's not really about the art. And then on the conservative side, now we're having this backlash. You're seeing the kinds of, movies that are coming out, the kinds of like, mockumentaries are being made about the left, and it's garbage from the other direction. Like it's not, none of it is good. It's corporatist from a different direction. It has different aesthetic trappings, but it's still nonsense. The thing, of course, that gets lost always here and forever is the arts, right? Because the arts, it's one of those things where it's always in the short term very useless, right? It's kind of like a gadfly. It's not, it's there to like really kind of like needle the status quo. But even before that, do you think there is some level of fandom just like in politics right now, like even beyond questions of the arts? Because when you see how people behave on Twitter, or you see, the kind of content that's being made, or you're seeing like all these pollsters that are supposed to be objective pollsters, then you see like some of their streams, and it's like, why would I ever trust this person with like objective data if this is the way that he discusses this or that question? It seems to me like the final frontier here is like video games and politics as a kind of like cosplay, right? To me, it seems like the ultimate kind of fandom now. And to the extent that people are receding into like themselves, if you recede into that, the effect, the net effect seems to be pretty similar to me, right? Like you're looking for some kind of savior from this other kind of angle. But if you take your argument in this book seriously, that these so-called revolutionaries will govern as settlers, and that's just kind of like the whipsaw effect back and forth, in the past and in the foreseeable future. So, like, what do you think about politics as a fandom?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of cross-pollination, in part because as politicians have recognized that the best way to increase their voter count is to reactivate voters who are trying to get away from politics or who are not heavily engaged. You can go on MSNBC, CNN, Fox, but you're just going to be talking to people who already know how they're voting. And they're people who, whether they're going to vote and who they're going to vote for, these are questions that aren't that difficult for them to answer. But if you go into the fandoms, then you can reach people that you wouldn't ordinarily reach, who wouldn't go looking for political content, but might get motivated to vote by your engagement with their fandom. So, for instance, Harrison Walls made a Fortnite level
Hmm.
in this last campaign, actually made a level in a video game. Campaigns currently aren't long enough to allow development time for campaigns to make proprietary video games themed around the candidate. But there is enough time at this point, and people are quick enough that you can make a level that's themed around a candidate for a major game like Fortnite. This kind of stuff will continue and will grow because the budgets of the campaigns, especially the presidential campaigns, are big enough that you actually can put real developmental effort into making quite serious entertainment products themed around a campaign. So this will definitely happen. We also saw it in terms of, very easily you can throw concerts that involve celebrity musicians. And this is something the Harris campaign worked quite hard on. They spent something like $20 million having major celebrities perform at Harris rallies. And that very much is a direct intermingling of the music fandom with the Harris people. Maybe you come to the rally for the music, and Harris is a side thing. Maybe it's a cheap, affordable opportunity to hear great live music or live music that you happen to like. And whether Harris is there or not is a whole different question. Maybe she's not even the main attraction at her own rally. Maybe you're wondering which celebrity will I get to see for free today? This is something which is increasingly common at American political events. You go to the RNC and you get to see the Hulk, and you go to the DNC and you get to see Little John. And you have no idea that these people are going to be there when you make the decision to go, maybe. So, yes, there's definitely been a lot of cross-pollination for sure. And there will be more and more of it because increasingly, this is where you're going to find Americans who are fringe voters. You're going to find them in these entertainment centers.
And to close out, just some more comments on the arts. Like to me, and I wonder what you think about this. My conception of the arts is that like real art is just no matter what political system you live under, even in like pure Marxism, right, of a kind that you and I would be interested in, and you don't really have class conflict, and you don't have those kinds of like really like material conflicts. Let's say we get rid of all that even in that system, to me, the arts are a necessary retreat. And it should be happening. People ought to be, if not like, I'm not saying necessarily like checking out of the political system, but th that sort of retreat it happens necessarily because real art is always some sort of response and a needling of the status quo, right? It doesn't have to be something like war, even if we get rid of war. It doesn't have to be class conflict if we get rid of class conflict, but there's going to be ideas out there. There's going to be modes of being. There's going to be something out there worth critiquing. And the arts are always, at the very least, like a few decades ahead, right? Of this kind of commentary of things that eventually become received wisdom. This is largely why many artists in their day, they're considered very dangerous, right? Not safe while they're alive. And of course, once they're dead, it becomes very, very safe to, like we see, not saying Malcolm X was an artist, but in political figures, like well, you have like Republicans, like holding up like Malcolm X as some sort of exemplar. Yeah, right. We have maybe Democrats sometimes like positively talking about some of these figures. Of course, Martin Luther King Jr. right near the end of his life, he was very much reviled for his stances on Vietnam. And for the arts, it's the exact same way. And the politics there, they're not very neat in the sense that I don't think it's a sufficient critique to say that somebody that like doesn't really do politics, let's say in the conventional sense, they haven't like totally retreated into themselves in an insular way into the arts if they just decide to only do art because that being like a great artist, right? It is necessarily kind of like a selfless act because first of all, you can't be a purely ego-driven artist, right? Because as let's say as a writer, you're doing a novel, right? You have like a sense of like, oh, I want the novel to be X, Y, and Z. As you're writing it, you're noticing it morphs, it changes. It's not what you expected it to be. If you're ego-driven, you'll say, no, I have to have it the way that I expected it, and you're going to damage the art as a result. And you're going to actually offer a lot less to the world because you caved into your ego, right? You are, the art is supposed to be in some ways that comes from you, but it also is supposed to be transcendental in relation to yourself. And to get back to like Bruce Ario, so like, he has like a political streak in the sense that he had a traumatic brain injury. He was homeless. He was drug addicted. And if it wasn't for those things, if it wasn't for the brain injury and the schizophrenia, he probably would have never become an artist. And I think it's very useful if people would look at somebody like Bruce and say, you know what, like Bruce had so many problems wrong with him, and he was able to become who he became. That is a very kind of positive small p political action, right? In the same way that you notice how whenever like a record is broken in athletics, some record that is considered to be like, oh, it's impossible to break this. Once it gets broken, within a couple of years, more and more people are breaking it because whatever limitations that they had, self-limiting beliefs are able to get beyond that. That's not capital P politics. It's not politics in the sense of Marxism. It is still kind of like individualistic, and politics can't be purely individualistic. But in that regard, right, like at the end, it is just kind of like, you are alone in the world, right? It's you against the world. Like he has a line in a poem, it was just between me and me, right? In the end, you really are just purely force, like facing yourself. And arts are always going to be just necessarily a needling of the status quo. They're going to be small p political, but it's not in ways that bear fruit until much, much later, right? Like it takes a long time for these kinds of effects from the arts to percolate out. It could be decades, it could even be centuries, but it does eventually happen, and it's hard to exactly measure what that effect is, how useful it is, but you know that it's useful. You know that it does something. You know that it changes lives in a way that, more kind of generic activism might not. So I would just really, draw a distinction between fandoms as they sort of exist in, modern culture versus true art, which is like, it is selfless. It is based on creating some sort of change in the world that you can't quite quantify.
Yeah, and one of the things that is really difficult about this problem that we're in is that there is an attempt to turn any artist into just someone who does fandom,
Hmm.
because there is this lack of access to the resources necessary to make art unless you're willing to just make fandom. And
Hmm.
there's this constant, therefore, material push on artists. Oftentimes, doing what would make it art will conflict with what would make it sustainable as a kind of life.
Hmm.
And this is how politics really attacks the enclaves. Each of the enclaves is in itself, in the beginning, a place of great beauty and interest. Science, in the case of futurism, art, in the case of
Hmm.
fandom, you know, faith can be extraordinarily meaningful and a very serious space. And the same goes for family, right? All of these things in their pure forms are beautiful, wonderful, meaningful sites of human activity. But what happens is that when you face sharp economic constraints that say you have to do family this way or you're not going to have enough money, you have to run your church this way, or your church is going to fail. You have to make this kind of content or you're not going to make it as an artist.
Hmm.
You've got to attract this startup money, or you can't do science. You have to get grants from these external organizations, or you can't do science. The effect of this is to very much limit the creative space for people. And so many of the things that are most precious to us that seem like they should be to some degree refuges from the political, that are meant to be our places where we reflect on social and political life from outside of it so that we can have meaningful thoughts about it and be able to then return to it from a position of having contemplated, really, is this the right way for us to live? Many of these spaces are under attack from these forces, which are really just about mining people for votes and mining people for labor.
Hmm.
And this is the problem that underlies all of this stuff. And it's very, very difficult to solve.
And it's also an ancient problem. I mean, like even going back to the 17, 1800s, like people like Charles Dickens and Dostoevsky, I think they would have been greater artists if they didn't have to sell their books like by the chapter, right? Like it just forces them to go, not to say that at their best they're not excellent, great artists, they are, but still like they would have had fewer, missteps if they weren't forced to, sell, like write like, how am I going to get paid essentially per word, right? That's so antithetical to the arts, right? Like how much am I going to get paid per minute of streaming? Right. Or now, like obviously, like you have so many songs that are capped to 2 minutes or less for TikTok. It's like this is so antithetical to human culture. And the thing is, like I don't want to, come off as a psychopath or anything, but like when I think of like human beings and human civilization, like literally the only reason why I think it's worth saving is because of culture, right? Like if you're not going to be able to be like engaged as a human being at the very highest levels, like if I'm not out there trying to like allow some little kid, to be able to do the kinds of things that I do, let's say artistically, because I'm lucky enough to be able to do it because my life just turned out that way, right? Like I want everybody to have that kind of, ability at least to try to do that without, other things getting in the way. Cause we really are just like, destroying, human talent. We're destroying, human futures by not doing that, right? By forbidding them from reaching these kinds of potential. So to me, it really is about culture, right? If you don't have culture, you might as well be an animal. And, since most of us are not vegans, right? Human beings in that regard are not more special to me unless they do something special, right? And I want to see everybody try to at least do something special. And with that, so
Yeah.
maybe we could have like the wall comes down, the paywall. After the paywall, we're going to discuss some more election stuff. Allan Lichtman. I'm not sure if you heard of the guy. Peter Zion, he had his own election predictions where Kentucky was going to go for Harris, among other things. So we'll discuss that. We'll discuss the rest of your book. We only went through like a page of notes, and I have two more full pages. So we're gonna have a lot more substance down the road. So thank you guys for watching thus far. It is patreon.com/machination to access the longer conversation. And again, Benjamin Studebaker's book is on well I think we should have two books, right? I still want to show your first book as well, right? The Chronic Crisis, because this book really does build upon it. I think that they are, logical complements to one another, right? So I would read them back to back, cover to cover. Thank you guys for watching this far, and for patrons, the show begins now.